maybe it's not a big catastrophe, actually, that you don't get to see my slides. What I was going to talk is quite a change in pace here, actually. It's not that I don't have views on what Homo erectus is and on the general pattern of human evolution, and it's easy for me to put them forward because I don't have a reputation to maintain, unlike my colleagues here. But I'm from a different kind of background. I'm much more involved in my own work in trying to understand something about the evolution of human behavior as you might interpret it from the artifacts and from other materials that you find at ancient archaeological sites, in particular animal bones, which are the next most common thing after artifacts. And what I wanted to talk about today was the evolution of human ability to make a living over the period of time that we've been talking about, beginning perhaps 1.8 million years ago, let's say, with the emergence of Homo ergaster, or African Homo erectus, and then working upwards in time, perhaps 200 or 250,000 years ago, after the Neanderthals had emerged in Europe, or at least their lineage had emerged in Europe, and Homo sapiens, our lineage, had emerged in Africa. I'm not going to say anything about the Far East. It's an interesting thing. If you're concerned with human evolution, drawing family trees and so forth, whether this Homo erectus thing is a strictly East Asian thing, whether you want to consider it that, or whether you want to think of it as more widespread, if you look at the artifacts from the time when people first arrived in East Asia, and we can argue about that. We've heard dates today of 1.6, 1.7, 1.8. Maybe they're right. I think it's still arguable about whether it's much before a million. But whenever it happened, whenever people arrived in East Asia, and then subsequently, their artifacts are very different than the kinds of artifacts that were being made at the same time in Western Eurasia and in Africa. The kinds of artifacts that we have in Western Eurasia and in Africa, for the most part, after 1.8 million years, not everywhere, and we can argue about why that might be, but the dominant artifacts after about 1.8 million years ago are the things that we assign to the Acheulean cultural tradition with hand axes, these big teardrop-shaped pieces. We also call them bifaces. You turn them over, doesn't matter which side you're looking at, you get a kind of a dull end at the bottom if you want to hold it that way, and a pointed end at the top. These things seem to be an invention of Homo ergaster, or African Homo erectus. They appear in East Africa at about 1.6, 1.7 million years ago, appear very abruptly. We don't know where they came from. We know that there were people making stone tools earlier, the kind that we call Oldowan stone tools after Olduvai Gorge, but there aren't any transitional stone tool assemblages, one that are intermediate between Oldowan and hand axe or Acheulean assemblages, and then suddenly the hand axe assemblages are there. Now, for perhaps a million or maybe 1.2 million, 1.3 years, hand axes were made more or less continuously. They show up in Europe very late, interestingly. We get them in Western Asia by 1.4 million years ago. They're not present at Dmanisi, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who lived at Dmanisi don't come from populations or aren't related directly to populations who made hand axes, because the hand axe itself, the actual form of the tool, is not the only indication of cultural change when hand axes are invented about 1.7 million years ago. There are other things that happen in terms of the way people strike flakes, particularly their ability to strike off very large stone flakes. And as far as I can determine from reading about the Dmanisi artifacts, we don't know whether they, in fact, or how they compare to Oldowan versus Acheulean artifacts. They lack hand axes, but they might still be, in fact, of that kind, if you like, that grade of artifact manufacture. In any case, when hand axes they appear in Western Asia about 1.4 million years ago, and then only very much later in Europe. It's a very strange thing. They suddenly appeared about 600,000 years ago. When they appear in Europe, they're a very advanced kind. It looks as if there was a change in hand axe manufacture, a change in the quality of it about 600,000 or 700,000 years ago. From relatively crude pieces where perhaps the shaping of the tool required removing of 10 or 12 flakes, and you get something that, yes, you can call a hand axe, to a time after 600,000 years when people are forming these things in a much more meticulous fashion, much more flaking. You get much more symmetry. The pieces tend to be thinner. They're obviously, in my mind, a world apart from the pieces that were made before 600,000 years. I think you could argue that the earlier hand axes from, say, 1.6 million, 1.7 million to 600,000 years, the artifact assemblages of which those hand axes are a part, are more different from the ones after 600,000 years than the ones after 600,000 years are from those after 200 or 250,000 years ago when people stopped making hand axes. Don't know why they stopped making the large hand axes, these large teardrop-shaped pieces. May have something to do with the invention of new ways of mounting stone flakes, much smaller tools on wooden handles or something of that sort, and doing with these now new tools things that people had done with hand axes before, and you could carry around these mounted flakes on wooden shafts, wooden handles, more efficiently, something like that. Something happened about 200, 250,000 years ago when people stopped making the hand axes. But I think that the continuity between the time before 250,000 when they were making these very sophisticated hand axes and the time afterwards when they stopped to make them is actually greater than between the earlier hand axe interval and the later. Now, it's interesting that when these more effective hand axes that appear, or more, I shouldn't say more effective, more sophisticated hand axes appear at 600 or 700,000 years, we get a couple things. We get the first appearance of these things in Europe. It's as if somehow now armed with these very much more sophisticated tools, there's a major out of Africa event, and the people who lived in Africa and in Europe, as far as we can tell from the limited fossils we have, 600 or 700,000 years ago, were very similar. Philip Reitmeyer has written extensively about this. We have a species term. Philip has used it repeatedly, Homo heidelbergensis, to describe this population, presumably of people spreading from Africa with hand axes about 600,000 years ago to Europe. And then they would be, Homo heidelbergensis would be the last shared ancestor of the Neanderthals, who subsequently emerged in Europe after 600,000 years, and of Homo sapiens, who had emerged in Africa after 600,000 years. Now, there were people in Europe earlier, and Jean-Jacques talked about them a moment ago. People from the Gran Dolina at Atapuerca in Spain, clearly there by 800,000 years. Again, there are no hand axes in the layer at the Gran Dolina at 800,000 years where we get these human remains that Jean-Jacques have on the screen. There are hand axes at Atapuerca later than that. Maybe a larger excavation in the Gran Dolina will turn up hand axes yet. Tiny little excavation down where those 800,000 year things come from. I don't think so, because when we get hand axes, as I say, they appear very abruptly in Europe at about 600,000 years. People who were in Europe earlier got there, like the Atapuerca people, the skull that Jean-Jacques showed from Ceprano in Italy, maybe 800,000 years old. We have a couple, therefore, pieces of evidence that there were incursions of humans into Europe at 800, maybe 900,000 years, and then they don't seem to have been able to hang on there. And it's only when they get the hand axe makers at 600,000 years that we get permanent occupation of Europe. And what's more, it extends quite far north in Europe, because the earliest evidence for European occupation at 800,000 years is far to the south, in Italy and in Spain. Now, what I was going to talk about, I've already talked more about it maybe about other stuff than I should have. If I had my slides, I would have been more circumspect and maybe more focused. But what I was going to talk about mainly, and what I'll end up with today, is how these people made a living, these hand axe makers. And I've been fortunate to work at hand axe sites in both Africa and in Europe, and the ones that I was going to show you slides of were in Europe, two in central Spain. They're dated to about 500,000 years. About 500,000 years is the operative term, because it's based on the kinds of animal fossils that occur at the sites. The sites are known as Torralba and Ambrona. They're more or less on the main road between Madrid and Barcelona, and if you happen to be going to Spain in the not very distant future, at the Ambrona site, the excavation is partially covered by a building, and you can go in and see the artifacts and the bones as they were uncovered in 1962. It was my first archaeological experience, actually. I suppose you could say maybe, I could have been an eyewitness to the events, given that date, that led to the deposition of the hand axes and the bones. In any case, these Acheulean sites in general, these hand axe sites, the ones that I was going to talk about in Spain, others that I know in Africa, and others that I know in Europe, they share a kind of common feature. They're almost always near ancient water sources, near ancient marshes or lakes or rivers, and you get a scatter of artifacts, including hand axes and bones, out away from the water source. And the tendency in times past was to assume that if these artifacts and bones were in the same layer, that, usually under lake deposits or lake edge deposits or river deposits, that the artifacts must have been used to kill and butcher the animals that are represented. Now, at these sites in Spain, Torralba and Ambrona, the principal animal species is a large elephant, Elephas antiquus. It's called the European woodland elephant, considerably larger than either the living African or Indian elephant. And the bones are abundant. There are hand axes and other artifacts scattered among them. And it would imply that if people, the hand axe makers, were killing and butchering these elephants, they must have been pretty proficient big game hunters. The other animals that are represented there would imply the same thing: horses, rhinos, things of that sort. And you go to Africa, and tomorrow, if my computer works in another session, I can talk about some of the African sites where I've worked, and the animals there, again, elephants and buffaloes, big animals that are associated with these hand axes and other tools. And again, if you just assume, based on the stratigraphic association, that the artifacts were used to kill and butcher the animals, then these people were doing pretty well in their hunting. Well, that was the common assumption, that simple stratigraphic association of artifacts and animal bones implied a functional association. That was the common assumption into the 1970s. And then a lot of archaeologists began to think, well, we really should examine this assumption a little more carefully. What is the actual evidence for people handling the animal bones, much less getting any meat or marrow out of them? The best way to get at that is to look at damage to the bones. Is there damage on the bones from stone tools? got the stone tools there. If people were using them to kill and butcher the animals, then you'd expect to see something on the bones from some kind of markings from the stone tools. So my job at the Thorab and Ambrona sites, besides being involved in the excavation, was to examine the animal bones, first to identify them, what kinds of bones are there, count the numbers of different kinds, count the number of different kinds of animals, but then to look at the damage to the bones. And what I found, which I guess I sort of knew in advance without ever having thought about it before, was that stone tool marks were very rare. What there's a lot of is chew marks from carnivore teeth. There are wolves that are represented in the deposit. There were also hyenas. The African spotted hyena was very widespread in Eurasia until actually just a few tens of thousands of years ago. And we have not only the hyena and the hyena bones at sites like Thorab and Ambrona, but we have their poops. They ingest bone. They suck the organic material out, your justice system does, and what comes out the other end is effectively powdered bone in the shape of a feces, what we call coprolites, and they're quite common at Thorab and Ambrona. So they were walking around. It's not just that, we have their fossils. We have evidence that they were doing things in life right there. Well, when you see that the damage to the bones is much more commonly from carnivore teeth and very rarely from stone tools, it's kind of hard to argue, I think, that the people were deeply involved in the animal bone accumulation at the site. You go to Africa, it's the same thing. Tomorrow I'll have another opportunity to talk about this in a different context, but you get exactly the same pattern. You get lots of artifacts, lots of bones, all stratigraphically associated. With the artifacts, there are also these hyena coprolites. You look at the bones, and the bones are very much more commonly damaged by carnivore teeth than they are by stone tools. And I think you can't help but conclude that whoever it is that was getting, let's not worry so much about how the animals died for the moment, but who's getting the meat, who's getting the marrow, it's hyenas, and maybe in Europe wolves, much more than it is people. The African sites are interesting in other ways because I think that you can look at some of the animals that are represented in the sites, things like tortoises, look at their average size and get some notion as to how hard people were preying, collecting these tortoises. It's a very different thing than big game hunting. There's no special skill involved, no weaponry or whatever. But as you press harder, if there are a lot more people pressing harder on the tortoises, the average tortoise size go down. And the tortoises that occur at hand axe sites are enormous. Same species as is around the sites today, but they're much bigger than any that have been seen since the hand axe times. To me, that suggests relatively few people pressing on them, and the reason there were relatively few people, I would argue, is because they weren't particularly proficient big game hunters. So I think if you were to go back in time to these Acheulean sites before 250,000 years ago, and you were to look around the landscape, you'd probably see, a lot of activity in the, you'd see prey animals, elephants, buffaloes, things of that sort. You'd see major predators. There were, of course, lions in Europe at the time. You'd see hyenas and whatever, and you'd see them doing their thing. And you'd probably have to look pretty hard for the people. There probably weren't very many of them, and when you did catch up with them, you probably wouldn't see them hunting very often. So that's the principal conclusion from my particular line of work. Now, when do we get evidence for proficient big game hunting? Well, it's after 250,000 years. You get up to the time of the Neanderthals, let's say after 130 or 100,000 years, and we have good evidence from the isotopic composition of the bones themselves. You can get some notion of the diet of the people, that they were top carnivores, and that they were, in fact, relying a great deal on getting meat and marrow out of animals and building it into themselves. And when you look at the bones that come out of the sites, the animal bones, they're covered by cut marks, even when the sites are, again, in this kind of waterside situation. And I should stress that's a very important thing. Because if you try and understand why, at a hand axe site, why you'd have all these artifacts and why you'd have all the animal bones, and yet they don't seem to have much to do with each other, well, both animals, particularly things like buffaloes and elephants, and people are going to be attracted to water sources. And you could have an elephant walk down to a marsh at Ambrona one day and just get mired down and die there, and people could come by 5 years later and drop a hand axe nearby, and from our perspective, 500,000 years later, we think that the people and the elephant must have been there at the same time. Geologically speaking, I suppose that's true. But in terms of the actual lives of the creatures involved, no. When you get into similar sites, as I say, after these waterside sites, after 200,000 years or so, 150,000 years or so, then you begin to see the evidence on the bones that people, in fact, were interacting with the animals, interacting at least with the bones, presumably getting some of the flesh, some of the marrow, in a much more substantial way. And of course, after 50,000 years ago, with the origins of anatomically modern people and their spread throughout the world, then you see it abundantly. On the other hand, you do Kristen Hawkes. I'm sure Kristen is still here. She wouldn't duck out on me. Where is she? There she is. Anyway, Kristen has studied famous for her studies with her colleagues, and Nick Burton-Jones is also in the audience. He's another person who's famous for work on the Hadza people in northern Tanzania. And Kristen maybe make a remark, if she feels like it now or later, about just how successful they are at hunting. Now, these are people who are armed with very powerful bows and iron-tipped arrows. Obviously, that's a fairly recent thing, but Kristen's work with her colleagues has suggested that, they're bringing down the big game that's around them. And these are, this is yesterday with this fine armament. So I suppose it kind of makes sense that if you go back 500,000 years and you look at these hand axe makers, even the people after 600,000 years who were making these very nice hand axes, that they weren't particularly good at hunting their populations, and that their populations were relatively restricted. Well, so you saw what you missed.
When I was a lad, there was a historian called A.J.P. Taylor, who some of you who lived in Britain may remember. He used to stand in front of a camera and he used to talk for half an hour about history. And it was absolutely spellbinding. And I've just seen the modern equivalent of A.J.P. Taylor. I think it was absolutely spellbinding. Kristen, do you want to sort of come to the defense of the Hadza macho male, or are you?
These guys are very good hunters, but Richard's point is so important. Here we have modern brains, modern technology in the sense that projectile weapons like this are very recent in evolution. They're very good at it. Their success rates are very low. There's no way you can support the population on that foraging strategy with modern people, etc. All these things that must inflate success rates. So the supposition that somehow that's generally been characteristic of the genus, one that really ought to be re-examined. So
I think it's effectively dead. It's just that the message is still to reach some of our colleagues.
No, the point Christians make, the Hadza people rely a great deal on what we call gatherable foods, even including things that most of us would not particularly regard as palatable. But they do, and as Kristen has documented, one of their major staples are rootstocks, underground plant materials that, in fact, take quite a lot of upper body strength to remove. But they don't rely for dietary purposes that much on meat. And this is probably true, go back 500,000 years, and it would be true, only more so. So when you're talking about these Acheulean people that 500,000 years ago, you're talking about people whose major dietary staples would have been plant foods, insects, small game, things, tortoises, things like that you could just pick up.
What were the hand axes used for?
I had a slide on that, actually. They're called hand axes, and there are some that sort of fit in your hand, and you can imagine chopping with them, and that's the origin of the term hand axe. I've seen ones, and I'm sure other people have, in East Africa that are that long. You didn't pick them up and chop with them. I can barely pick them up. And then they're tiny ones, relatively speaking. They vary in size, they vary in shape. They're probably kind of multi-purpose tools, a lot of different things that they did with them. There's a very interesting speculation. There are sites where they occur in vast numbers. The old Orgosili site, I think Susan had a picture of a partial skull that was recently found at old Orgosili. This is a hand axe site dating between roughly 900,000 and perhaps 400,000 years long sequence. And there are places there where they're just literally carpets of hand axes. I've also seen things like this in South Africa. What are you doing with this enormous concentration of hand axes? Well, a couple of English archaeologists suggested that maybe they were the Acheulean equivalent of a peacock's tail, that men made these hand axes. They tried to make the nicest ones they could, and women are sitting around watching this happen. And when they see a particularly well-made hand axe, they say, that's the guy for me, and then the hand axe.
I think it's the Paleolithic version of a powerboat, basically.
But in fact, where we have these dense concentrations of hand axes, it's almost certainly a situation where there's been geologic winnowing, and there have been, the multiple layers have been compressed. And so you're looking at something that is not natural in that kind of sense. It's not that the Acheulean people were making a carpet. They weren't.
Jim?
Yeah. As a primatologist, I've got no reputation to lose here. Is it possible, one thing about the Hadza, they're living in a fairly depauperate and fairly poor habitat compared to many other places. and also in the Holocene. East Africa is depauperate with respect to the large fauna, the megafauna. The other thing I was thinking about what would you do if you're a hominid, a human, killing an elephant in an area that has a lot of lions and a lot of wolves and a lot of hyenas. Would you ever get to the bone in your cutting of meat, or would you just sort of take steaks? This is sort of a model of the saber-tooth, which is thought to have killed megafauna and then just eaten the soft bits because they didn't want to break their teeth. But what about hominids killing and taking the soft bits because they didn't want to be around when the hyenas arrived? To explain the lack of cut marks there, and then simultaneously the dodginess, the potential dodginess of the Hadza as an analogy for Middle Pleistocene Europe.
Have you got that question?
Can I say something
Yeah.
in response to that? Maybe Nick will chime in. I question you, what is modern habitat? What is it? How, in what way is it an analog for one at a time? And that's always tricky. How do you do it? But there are ways that you can estimate those things by looking at the density. Remember, these guys are right on the edge of the Serengeti, right? And one of the things that you can do is look at the density of large game populations and rainfall. And O'Connell's, which are Nick and I working on this Hadza project with Jim O'Connell, who is the archaeologist on the team and especially interested in these questions, has done those things, compared game densities and estimated rainfall for both the contemporary Hadza catchment and for an array of places where we do have archaeological sites in time and space in East Africa. And there are some of those places, if O'Connell were here, he could give you page and date, and maybe Nick can, I can't, where the biomass might have been greater. There might have been more large animals than there are in the Hadza environment, but there are not very many. And for some of the places where there is Pleistocene archaeology of interest, the biomass density would have been less than among the modern Hadza. So it does look like, investigating exactly the question you ask, that this does tell us, it does give us a data point we ought to pay attention to.
No, that's what's the tuber? Does it do temperate habitats produce tubers to the same degree that
in contemporary environments, the sort of higher latitude range for a lot of these big tuber-producing species is about 40 degrees, which is just about as far as people get until we get to modern people. How serious we ought to take that. I mean, now we've got those. It does look like 40 degrees is about the limit. These recent Chinese data, put about 40 degrees. And it is a place where plants using strategies like this still are successful, but not much further north.
What about at high altitude? Did it go that high up in the latitude? Because after all, the potatoes come from the equator, very near the equator.
Right. So altitude. You mean, is there going to be a limit in
mountains where the tubers will be water?
Wow, what a good question. I mean, right, South America, it's the high altitude places where tubers do so well. So I haven't a clue. I don't really know what the altitudinal variation is of archaeology in the Paleolithic. You guys would know about that.
Yeah, I was curious to know how widespread the use of fire was, and at what point do you think they started to actually make fire?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's such a central issue, isn't it? If you're trying to understand anything about the spread of people, particularly out of Africa, how they got to where they did, could they have done it without fire? My feeling is no. But the fact is that the oldest really secure evidence for fire, what's secure evidence? Ajit was presenting, before we began here, a website that he's going to have where when you get information from it on all kinds of aspects of human evolution, you'll have a notion of how certain the particular conclusions or particular data are. You've got a scheme for doing it. Well, the fire thing is really a wonderful example of why you would want to do that. Because if you take the evidence that I think would be most certain, fireplaces, rings of stones with an ash and charcoal lens inside, younger than 200,000. Now, if you say, well, what about a place where there's some burnt bones and people were obviously living there, that you can take back to 1.5 million years ago in South Africa, it's Fort Crown's Cave. If you're looking for things in between, perhaps the best case is from a site in Israel called Gesher Ben Yaakov, published in Science last year, where there are clusters of burnt flint chips. Now, are these fireplaces, or could they be places where there was vegetation? Somehow the chips are concentrated around the vegetation, and the vegetation just smolders for a very long time. I don't think that's what it is. I think it actually represents human control of fire, and this would be at about 790,000 years. But it's debatable. You move upwards in time a little bit. We have the Zhoukoudian site in China, dated between, let's say, 600,000 and 400,000 years. It's got some burnt bones. It's said in the past to have some layers of ash and charcoal. That hasn't been verified. There's no good evidence for mineral ash here, but there still are the burnt bones, and they occur in some frequency. I think some layers 11 or 12%. What burns bones in a cave, but human activity. But, that's the kind of problem that you have. I can't imagine if you get people at Dmanisi in Georgia, what is it, 40 some odd degrees north. It gets pretty chilly in the winter there today. It's probably got pretty chilly there even, one point. I have some doubts, problems with the date, but let's say it's 1.7 million years ago. Could people have lived there without fire? I kind of doubt it. Could they have lived in North China? If they actually got to North China 1.6 million years ago, I have some problems with that date too, but it might be, let's say it's 1.1 still. Pretty early. Could they have gotten there without fire? I kind of doubt it. What do you need fire for? I mean, you need fire for warmth, but you also, if you're going to do anything with animals, you're probably going to need fire to pre-prepare the muscle tissue before you get it into your stomach, because we're not very good at digesting raw muscle tissue. So you can make circumstantial arguments for a very early use of fire in order to get people out of Africa to Dmanisi and China, or you can go with the really hard evidence when you find fireplaces in archaeological sites, and that gives you a discrepancy of somewhere between 1.7 million years ago for the earliest fire up to, say, 200,000. I could show you pictures, on my computer. Anybody wants to stick around to see
That's what they all say, Richard.
You get I can show you that are unquestionable. I mean, you get this zebra striping in archaeological sites, the ones I've worked at in South Africa. You get these stacked fireplaces, starting at, say, 120. No question about it. People walking into those sites, and they must have, building fires, and they must have had complete control. I don't think they're wandering around, hoping for a lightning storm to do that. But, that's very recent. So it's a good question, but I wish I had a better answer.
Richard, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to bring us to wrap it up.